All right, welcome to the Monday Market Update, where we're here to update you in good times and in bad when the bond market is doing well and when it's not doing so well. So Mr. Nash Paradise, the lone wizard, with me today to tell you all the reasons why the bond market threw a hissy fit last Friday and what we're going to look forward to in the week ahead, and then just some market insights from a couple of mortgage guys. How you doing, Nash?
I'm doing well. Ready to get into this. Last week was obviously a little wild. This week, I feel like we got some things to get excited about. So, we'll balance our complaining and moaning about last week's finish. If only someone maybe a week ago, like right now, the second said, "Hey, Friday could be bad. Don't hold on to your pipeline." Maybe.
I recall. It would be cool if people over at U Mortgage could just do a clip of Nash basically saying like lock before Friday with like the date flashing above you so that, it's the proof is there. It's etched in stone. You said it.
Stamp it. Yeah, you can call me Nastradamus right now. But hey, let's jump into this nerd stuff, try to make some good predictions again. And, let's sum up what happened last week as we jump into the slides. So looking at last week, we had the big circle on Friday because Friday was non-farm payrolls, unemployment rate, all that good stuff. But to have a better understanding of Friday, we really got to back up to the information from earlier in the week. Looking at jobless claims being up, and the jobless claims number is kind of high anyway. Like we were anticipating 235,000, came in at 247. Continued claims stayed consistent. Going back to Wednesday, manufacturing numbers missed big time. The ISM manufacturing PMI, nerd stuff, but basically just our manufacturing as a country was expected to increase slightly and be a little over that middle ground threshold of a 50 rating. And they're, anticipating 52. Cool. Came in at 49.9. That was a pretty big miss. So we saw rates improve. We saw treasury yields drop on Wednesday. But as we got to the end of the week, what we found out was that was largely in anticipation of missing on non-farm payrolls. So we've got some incongruent information here because if you just look at it as a snapshot, Friday's data, I know you can't see it on the small screen, but let me tell you, we were anticipating non-farm payrolls in at 130,000. We talked about that was a pretty low number anyway compared to the previous 177. Now, put a big asterisk on that because it was revised down to 147, missed by 30,000. I mean, like 27% miss. Sorry, 17% miss. But who cares about that miss? Absolutely no one. Why that miss doesn't move markets and we keep missing so poorly and revising the non-farm payrolls numbers, I don't know. But when the numbers finally shook out Friday morning, we hit 139,000 off of 130,000 expectation. That's pretty close to where we would expect it. Unfortunately, though, the Wednesday numbers, the Thursday numbers, they all had the market primed and prepped to miss by a much wider margin, to see those non-farm payrolls be short, to have not added 139,000 jobs. So to sum up what happened last week, Wednesday set us up for a good old Friday failure, and it didn't fail. So we saw a strong reversal in bonds. The 10-year treasury just went nuts after the 8:30 a.m. Central Time data came out. it was just a race to the top and not a lot of fun. Any thoughts, comments, questions on that, Matthew?
Well, I was out of town at a sweet conference, so I wasn't paying attention. Sometimes when I'm sitting in the office, if I want to torture myself, I'll have some of that stuff on in the background. Before I forget, though, I just want to say what's up to some of the people that are joining us. Kevin Hawthorne from Florida, thanks for joining, brother. We've got the financial firefighter joining us from Hawaii. JP Goski in the comments, thanks for your support, brother. And is it Flavio? Yeah, Flavio, good morning from Grandview, Washington. So thanks for joining. If you guys have any questions or want to bounce something off of us, throw it in the comments. I'll make sure that Nash and I, before we close, speak on it, because there's the numbers, and then there's kind of the reaction to the numbers from consumers and professionals like agents. I like talking about that stuff because that's the boots on the ground stuff that I think people might not be able to read by just reading reports or seeing numbers.
So to sum up your position here, Matt, you weren't paying attention, and it didn't matter because you already knew not to leave your pipeline hanging until Friday, so you're able to enjoy your trip to the conference without having to stress out about what's going on with rates.
Exactly. I liked it, so I locked it, and then when the market went crazy on Friday, I was like, I listened to my buddy Nash. Nash knew that we weren't going to gamble going into Friday. Here we are.
That's why we're a good team. Let's jump into this week's stuff so we can make some predictions and have a good idea what to expect. This week is not set up quite so crazy for things to move, thankfully, but the date to circle this week is Wednesday. And there's not a lot of action going on Monday, Tuesday. In fact, what we're seeing right now is a lot of bonds reacting and kind of evening out after the overreaction on Friday. I think one of the key drivers for this, and you may or may not know this, is the European Central Bank. So Euro bonds and the Euro, basically their equivalent of the Fed funds rate, their overnight interest rate, it was dropped last week. It was the 8th drop this year. So they are scorching the U.S. as far as dropping interest rates in their own battles with inflation. Things have gone down, spending has dropped. And they lowered their overnight average from 2.25% to 2.0. So we are well over the European Central Bank right now. And so it's going to be interesting to see the differences in those. I have a feeling we're going to see a lot more political pressure coming in on the Fed to, match some of these other central banks and their dropping of the interest rates. It's always some delayed, activity. Like once you drop rates, it's going to be a while. And I think one of the most common criticisms of our current Fed board is being too late. I've been vocal about the fact that they were way too late to increase interest rates. And it really, in my opinion, made inflation spiral out a lot further than it needed to. I mean, we were just too low for too long. And now we've been holding a little too high for too long. That as we get into what's going on this week, this things to look at. We've got core CPI month over month May on Wednesday morning, as well as headline CPI and the year over year core CPI. I think the interesting thing about this is projections and analysts are showing an increase in the month over month inflation, as well as the year over year, from 0.2 to 0.3% on the month over month, 2.8 to 2.9. Remember, core takes out energy and food prices. So that's why investors and traders really like to look at that core CPI as opposed to the headline. But they're all expected to increase. The headline CPI from 2.3 to 2.5, that's a pretty big increase. And so I'm watching this thinking, maybe we miss. Maybe we don't have the increasing inflation people are expected. I know the jobs numbers for new jobs are added, but jobless claims, continued claims, manufacturing, PMI, they would all suggest that inflation is actually coming down a little bit and not being heavily impacted by the tariffs right now. So if that holds up, Wednesday could be a good day. If we come up short on those, could be excellent for interest rates. And I think with those numbers coming out early, 8:30 a.m. Central Time, it's not a terrible idea to be ready to roll and see what happens depending on what the next, today and tomorrow look like. We are primed for a rally. If it comes, fantastic. If it doesn't, I don't think there's too much downside risk with what we're looking at this week.
Yeah, and what's funny is I'm an eternal optimist, and the stuff that I was kind of reading or reviewing before our call today was warning to the other side, right? The fact that some of these inflation numbers, since we're looking at May's number, and last May was a relatively low inflation reading. Like there's fear that this month's number, which will be the May number, could show an uptick. It could have a negative impact on bonds, and it's really the first one that has the potential to have a little bit of inflation from tariffs baked in. If there was some costs passed on to the consumer because of the tariff stuff that was going on. So I guess we shall see what comes of Wednesday's number. I think that it's just something to circle on the calendar, like you said, and be aware that it's going to be a market mover, probably one way or another. So be on the lookout.
Well, you hope it's going to be a market mover. And we also have U.S. and China trade talks taking place in London. Like anything can come out of the government right now and completely derail the data. The data is only relevant as long as there's nothing more important showing up. So, keep that in mind. Put a big old asterisk on there. That's really just to protect me so I can be right either way. If you haven't noticed, that's the theme here is I'm always going to find something to be right about. If I make enough predictions, better than 50-50 makes me an expert. So let's talk about the Fed and where things are going as we move through our slide deck here. You'll notice not a lot of changes from the last time we talked. Still, basically no chance of any kind of Fed cut here in June, regardless of whatever influence is coming from our administration. It's too soon. As we get a little deeper with the trade talks with China, as we look at the European markets, I wouldn't be surprised if we see the 730 figure in the next couple of weeks increase a little bit from that 14% likelihood. I do think it could get up to 30-40% likely. I still don't think we're going to be moving by then, which is a little unfortunate because that's a pretty wide gap. That 45 days or so from the end of July to September. Just thinking back with what the European Central Bank and some of these other central banks have done, to think that the U.S. is not going to cut rates a single time until September is not awesome, but that's exactly what this chart is showing. The first likely rate cut, September 17th, and we're still projecting 2 rate cuts right now this year, with the second one projected in December. I do think we will get those 2 cuts this year, just because I don't think anything's going to be impacting inflation. I mean, we're talking 0.25% here, and we're not at a small level. Going from that 450 to 425, 425 to 400, you're still 2% over the ECB. And I mean, that's just pretty high. And like I said, it's going to take a long time after these, cuts happen before we see any major movement. But 2 cuts this year, still holding steady. It'll just be interesting to see the way these numbers shake out week over week.
Yeah, like you said, Powell is a slow mover, and he's proven, I guess, over the last 3+ months that the political pressure isn't really going to change his stance. He just continues to say, data dependent, I will wait, and he's going to take his sweet time. And kind of regardless of where you stand on that, I heard some people on something I was watching over the weekend. It's like, cut the darn Fed funds rate, and if you have to increase it down the road, so be it. But I think for whatever reason in his mind, he's like, I'm going to wait until absolutely have to, so there's not going to be any backtracking or kind of waffling back and forth.
Yeah, there's no U-turns here. Powell is either going uphill or downhill, and we're going in that direction pretty consistently. And that's been consistent for his entire time as Fed chair. So there's not, a lot of – now we have seen a couple of Fed moves where it was 0.5%, which is pretty big. It's essentially 2 increases or 2 cuts at the same time. But what we haven't seen is a lot of up and down. So I think we're getting closer to that goal inflation rate. And I think possibly Wednesday's data could help us get there. But, if we do take that back step and, the headline CPI jumps up 2.5% from that 2.3, then that's really solidifying no rate drops until September. But while we're here, what's important about that? What's going on in interest rates? Let's jump and talk about rates. Last time we met, we've got this drop. We've got this increase. We've got this drop again. We had some good stuff last week, and then we finished the week with a very, very sharp increase. And guess what? We've already gotten 15 basis points back today. So we are really living in this just under 7% world. You know, it had gotten down to as low as like 6.82, 6.83 for the overnight average, which honestly is a fairly balanced spot to be when you've got FHA, VA loans in the mid sixes, conventional loans in the high sixes, low sevens. We're still seeing movement. There's still a, inventory imbalance with a lot of listings compared to few buyers. And 0.25% is not going to change that. There's not a lot of buyers that are going to jump out there when we drop to 6.6 or 6.7. So it's not doing a lot to move things, but thankfully for anyone seeing this and noticing that rapid uptick, we are headed the other direction right now. And I mean, we've been in this world, for the most part of 2025, when you look at the averaging, and there's been some highs and lows here, but these numbers are pretty far apart. These are 0.25% apart from each other. So since the end of 2024, a couple blips under 6.75, a couple over 7%, but for the most part, we've been hanging out in this, 6.75 to 7% range, and there's no reason to anticipate that changing, anytime here real quickly.
Right. Yeah. Bouncing around in that same range. And, I think what will happen with the housing market, for what it's worth, is what I'm seeing. Inventory has started to kind of stack up in different places, and we've already passed, if people, aren't paying attention, like the busiest time of the year. Home buyers in March and April are trying to get moved. They're closing in April, May, and June. And so as, buyer demand kind of wanes off and comes off of peak, sellers are going to be in a position to have to get creative to sell their homes. And I've seen more and more, Nash, of sell it like the builder type of strategy. And I think it's good. I think it's healthy for the housing market. I think it's good for buyers. You're in a position where, these rates have bounced around between 6.75 and 7%, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily where you need to be at. Maybe you are, but then you have all your closing costs paid for. Or maybe you get in a position where you're like, first year is 5.875, and then you're 6.875 on until you have an opportunity to refinance. But there's a lot of creativity and a lot of ways for buyers to kind of take advantage of this current market that we're in. So that's what I like, because I'm team buyer as always.
Yeah, well, and your team boots on the ground. So, obviously you've got slightly different perspective out there in California, but we're seeing the same things here. And I'll close out here. My call to action is actually directed towards listing agents. So what we're seeing in my market, but also mostly across the country, is there's a huge delineation between well-represented, well-marketed, well-staged, well-photographed homes that have something unique. The things that are moving quickly, and there are things moving quickly. It's such a have and have nots right now. I've got buyers who are having to compete with 3 or 4 other offers on homes. And then I've got buyers, like you said, getting tons of closing cost credits. Appraisals are coming in high, $20,000, $40,000, $60,000 price reductions. And something that I haven't seen much in the 19 years I've been doing this is if a home is marketed and priced even just a little bit too high, people they know they can wait. There is not that whole, well, I'll just offer, 20 grand under and see what I can do when it's newly on the market. They're just passing. They're waiting. How far will this go? How far will this drop? How desperate is this seller? And when things are priced aggressively and it has some unique things, and you can tell that this home has been marketed well, it's got good open houses and good activity, it's moving quickly. And that is, spurring that, that YOLO, and people are jumping in and going quick and making competitive offers. And it's really, I don't know that most agents see enough activity like we do here. And of course, having 50 loan officers on my team, we see a lot of homes go off and on the market. And the fact is that right now, if you're not unique, if you're not special, you got to be priced special from the front, because if you make a mistake in that listing, if you let that seller push you just a little bit, we'll see if we can get this. It's not a good strategy right now. And it's probably the most important time I've ever seen in any market to be priced well, because buyers know if it doesn't sell in that first weekend, I've got a lot of time to watch it fall.
Agreed. wholeheartedly, man. It's a market where buyers are more picky. So as a seller, you got to be smart and strategic. You definitely have to work with a pro. So thanks as always, brother. Next week is Fed week. We'll get your insight. We'll get your predictions before we go into it. Right now, yeah, like we looked at 99%. We'll see if that number moves for if there's going to be any action next week. Thanks, man.
Yeah, man. Take care.